All right, moving on to Tomlinson.
All right. The project I've been working on started from the question, what can arts entrepreneurs specifically learn by thinking about the rhetorical aspects of entrepreneurship? When I talk about rhetoric, I'm thinking about the means of persuasion in a specific contingent situation. And this is the question I took on in an upcoming paper, and now I'm hoping to go over some of the preliminary findings from that study and maybe get some feedback on the possibilities moving forward. So, basic thesis here is that the concepts from rhetorical theory can help both span and challenge distinctions that arts entrepreneurs make between business practice, artistic practice, social practice, and that this helps these arts entrepreneurs think about their work more creatively, more productively as a unified process. At the same time, as researchers and educators thinking about this, we get a set of conceptual tools, terminology that can help us articulate what makes arts entrepreneurship distinct as a discipline and help open opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration. So at the moment, my goal is to further explore how arts entrepreneurs use rhetoric in creative ways and what arts educators can take away from this. Basic methodology that I'm using starts with a rhetorical analysis of an arts venture and then tries to connect these findings from the rhetorical analysis with models from entrepreneurship to see where there's resonance, where there's friction, and what we can learn. Specifically, I take on a materialist rhetoric framework because I think it's important to understand the interaction of human and non-human agents and how influence persuasion can happen not necessarily with intention. It's kind of post-humanism. I think it's especially important as we see self-taught algorithms start to take over social media marketing. Businesses are using similar black box AI to handle information analytics, inform decisions. So when we use rhetorical language to talk about arts entrepreneurship, which is essentially my goal here, we gain a few different things. The first is a focus shifts from the individual entrepreneur to sort of rhetorical ecology of entrepreneurship that they operate in. This is sort of following some of William Gardner's work, especially recent projects, but I want to emphasize this as another alternative to a traits-based approach. For a specific example, we can start to think of entrepreneurial opportunity in terms of the rhetorical notion of kairos. Classical Greek term roughly translates to right timing or due measure. But in rhetorical theory, we use this to think about how the complex factors in a specific situation give rise to a unique, situated, collectively inspired response. And we can think of the idea of kairos alongside opportunity actualization as an alternative to traditional opportunity discovery approach or opportunity creation. Now, the second thing that I'm proposing we gain from this is to more closely attend to the myths and metaphors that arts entrepreneurs use to sustain their practice, as well as the metaphors that researchers have to use. So, for one example, the case study that I've been doing focuses on industrial music. The source literature on industrial music is filled with references to what they call the information war. It's an idea taken from the author William Burroughs, but these industrial musicians infused it with concepts from French post-structuralist philosophy, Aleister Crowley's occultism, all sorts of diverse trains of thought coming together in intellectual bricolage. Now, the idea of intellectual bricolage, it generally means making do with whatever is at hand. But Claude Lévi-Strauss, who coined the term, also used it to refer to the nature of myths, the nature of function in myths, and intellectual thought of academic research. So, if we think about the case of the information war, for these artists, it serves a function of connecting business and aesthetic practice in a way that artistic innovation and entrepreneurial innovation can be understood as the same sort of phenomenon. So, when industrial musicians talk about information, they're using it as a catch-all term for the experimental music they make, the experimental film they make, the philosophy that inspires them and that they produce. And then they use the idea of disseminating information as a reimagined way to think about marketing avant-garde art to a popular public. Now, as an entrepreneur, researcher, or educator, we can also start to look at this sort of rhetoric that they use and do our own intellectual bricolage, start to meet these phenomena on their own terms, understand how arts entrepreneurs start to think about their own work. Back to the idea of the information war, my next step in this case study was to look at a range of other theories that employ the same kind of militant metaphors as information war. I lean pretty heavily on Howard Becker's description of revolutionary change in an art world as a sustained ideological attack on organizations and the discourse of the art world. Also, interestingly, one of the influences on the information war was the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, whose idea of art is that it's an active resistance, organization of counter-information. We can also, of course, look to Schumpeter's rhetoric of creative destruction, which serves to highlight the change that's not just essential to capitalism, but it's really important for a rhetorical analysis if we're interested in how messages have effects in a specific environment. Now, all of these things taken together lead to a sort of vision of the arts entrepreneur as a critical rhetorician who's making an argument for aesthetic and economic reorganization or change, and they're making this argument through the sorts of innovations that they introduce. But here again, we need to think about rhetoric as material, as beyond the scope of pure intention, because the full implications of any sort of innovation are never fully imagined by the creator. The sort of change always happens in collaboration between human and non-human actors in the situation. If I'm allowed to pull another example from experimental music, we can think of circuit-bending guitar pedals. There are pedals like DoD's death metal distortion that are just as well-known and popular for their unintended uses, for the nature of their circuitry and the kind of sounds you can get when you manipulate it. So the death metal pedal is popular as a circuit bending tool. It's popular in noise music as a standalone instrument when you hook it up in irregular configurations. There's even a local arts entrepreneur who sells samples made from a modified version of these pedals, all coming from just the nature of the circuitry rather than the sound it was supposed to make. I'm slowly getting to another important point, which is how myths evolve. The information war metaphor started to die out and shift to metaphors of the virus, of virality, and of assimilation by the mid to late 80s. This second generation of industrial artists took, we might call it total war strategy if we're sticking with the militant metaphors, where music, film, marketing, business practice are all sort of the same aesthetic paradigm, all the same ideological weight behind them. So the second generation took this practice, but instead of attacking existing discourses, it started to more thoroughly assimilate things like dance music, rock music, heavy metal, extreme metal. And this is what set the stage for the explosion into the mainstream in the 90s, when industrial music properly went viral. And this is what most people think of when they hear the term industrial. Now we can see the metaphors of the virus versus metaphors of attack maybe more clearly in a different setting. If any of you are familiar with movement watches, they've got, in their mission statements, there's a sort of qualitative war metaphor, like to disrupt the overpriced, outdated models of the fashion industry. But it's a little different from their slogan, which is join the movement. And there you hear more of a viral, assimilating sort of metaphor to it. And this slogan plays out a lot more clearly in their business practice as well. They target a younger demographic, not necessarily the ones who are consuming these luxury watches in the first place. And social media is not just important to their marketing strategy, but to how they run their business sales. It starts from this notion of virality. So here we can kind of see war metaphors have an emancipatory appeal to them. It's important for the sort of early avant-garde, but there's more room to expand into the mainstream by emphasizing a viral metaphor. We can see this with movement and with the evolution of industrial music. So the last thing that it looks like we can gain by putting arts entrepreneurship into rhetorical language is a conceptual bridge with the humanities. Being able to talk about art and entrepreneurship as manifestations of the same sort of rhetorical process doesn't just make the subject more appetizing to humanities students. More importantly, it opens ways for students to start bringing in their own understandings and experience and engage in intellectual bricolage themselves. This educational strategy means educators improvising with an array of different concepts pulled from different disciplines so that they can engage students with diverse backgrounds. The end goal here is to empower students to start to create their own discourses, use rhetoric to create myths like the information war that can both motivate them and constructively inform how they practice entrepreneurship. That's my thoughts so far. Happy to take comments, questions, feedback.